History of Poland podcast, episode 44, The Return of the King. Hello and welcome back. Last time, we left off with the death of Leszek the Black. Leszek was a fine ruler, I suppose, but it wasn't like he was some great king of old. Rather, he was like the rest of this long line of Piast rulers, middling, with bouts of exceptionalism, followed by a lack of eye towards succession planning. Yet, in spite of this long line of mediocre rulers, Poland is slowly but surely becoming greater than the sum of its parts. It's one of the great mysteries of Piast Poland. Today, though, we're going to be entering into a new phase of Piast Polish history. It's not going to be just a bunch of knights and cousins fighting against each other. It's not entirely going to be a bunch of knights and cousins fighting against each other. But while it does stick with that depressingly familiar narrative, there are hints in the background that are starting to show through. Hints about the end of the fragmentation of Poland, about the reunification of the state, and about a prosperous future. Hints about a king. A king who you should try to pick out who you think it is early, if you can. We start with the question on everyone's mind after the death of Leszek the Black. Who is in charge now? Unfortunately, Leszek really didn't leave a clear heir and had no one in line to take his place, which, as you can probably guess, probably had everyone around thinking of Alexander the Great's reported final quip, who, when asked by his generals who is to succeed him, apparently responded, "To the strongest." Well, we did talk last week about how Henry IV the Righteous was chosen by the people of Krakow to rule over them. It wasn't as if Henry was without opposition. In fact, he had both allies and enemies aplenty. Arrayed against him were Duke Bolesław of Mazovia and Władysław the Short, also known to us as Władysław the Elbow High. Władysław in particular would prove to be a thorn in the side of Henry. On Henry's side were your typical grab bag of nobles, with the key standout being Przemysł II, the Duke of Wielkopolska. So, those are the key characters to be concerned with today. Henry was acclaimed Duke of Krakow, but being acclaimed and being Duke are two very different things. Henry was aware of that and realized very quickly that he'd be incapable of holding his position without owning the surrounding lands. Unfortunately for Henry, the lands around him were owned by Władysław the Short. Wisely, Henry retreated and left Krakow to its fate. Its fate? To be invaded by Władysław and his forces. As Długosz tells us, quote, "The townspeople do not dare resist one who enjoys the support of their bishop and knights and open the gates to Władysław. He is received both in the city and in the castle and proclaimed Duke of Krakow. He installs himself in the castle, where he has shown greater submission than in the city." Undeterred by this setback, Henry of Wrocław sends another force against Krakow. Its approach is kept secret, which allows those of the townspeople who still support Henry to admit it one night. Władysław is all but taken alive, as he is making the rounds of the sentries in the city. But he manages to escape on foot with a few of his knights, who disguise themselves as Franciscan monks and are led out through the city wall where it runs beside the monastery. Continuing on, Długosz says that, quote, "The real rebels, and those who either supported Władysław or have been slow in submitting to the Duke's authority, are punished by having their crops destroyed, their manors and houses burned to the ground, and after this they submit. Henry then releases the bishop and all the knights he had taken prisoner, installs a strong garrison in Krakow to prevent Władysław from launching another attack, and takes measures to deny the knights the means to defect. The war over, he rewards some of his knights, and even the Franciscans who saved Władysław, giving their houses various privileges." End quote. So that's good news, right? Henry is doing well, being benevolent to those who once fought against him, and solidifying rule. I bet you're thinking that the king I mentioned would be Henry, no? Well, I hate to break it to you, but you're wrong. In fact, it's at this exact moment that Henry is going to die, apparently due to poison. This poison was evidently a slow-working poison, though, because Henry apparently knows he's going to die, and, for once, a Piast ruler, get this, plans for their succession. He leaves Wrocław to his uncle Konrad, and then he claims to send emirate to Przemysł of Wielkopolska, while a small sliver is left for his wife Matilda. He dies on July the 2nd in Wrocław. Konrad has trouble taking possession of his inheritance, while Przemysł finds that Sandomiriec and Krakow are easier put in your title than actually possessed. So while Przemysł does start calling himself the Duke of Krakow and Sandomiriec, he doesn't really have a firm grasp on power there, since, much of that land is currently under the control of Władysław the Short. But it's not all bad news. Przemysł was named the successor to the Duke of Pomerania on his death, so he is growing in power, just not over Sandomierz and Krakow. With that, the tumultuous year of 1290 is over, and we drive right on into 1291. 1291 contains an interesting twist in the story. You see, in all of the fighting and posturing over who would rule Krakow, both Duke Przemysł and Władysław the Short forgot about somebody. Gryfina, the widow of Leszek the Black. Gryfina is looking at all the moves being made and apparently thinks to herself, if I'm not careful, I'm going to lose my lands. So, rationally, she sends a letter to her nephew, Wacław of Bohemia, also known to us as Wenceslas II of Bohemia, granting him the rule of both Krakow and Sandomierz in perpetuity with an invitation to come visit his new lands soon. Now, I don't mean to be harsh, but this does strike me as being a bit absurd. But instead of railing against this decision of hers, I'm going to let the absurdity come from the mouth of Długosz, who says, quote, anyone but Wacław would have taken such a deed of gift as a joke, or a leg pull, for it is inconceivable that a woman from Bulgaria should have been entitled to make presents of Polish duchies. The Duchess, however, falsely insists that her late husband gave her the authority to do this, and that she has a document to prove it. This document, if it ever existed, can only have been a forgery. Indeed, even Leszek the Black, though himself childless, could not have granted her powers so detrimental to his own brothers and the other Polish dukes, his relations. But Wacław, the Prince of Bohemia, who in the previous year illegally removed his cousin Nicholas from the Duchy of Opava, is avid to get his hands on other Polish duchies, and so seizes this opportunity, accepts the deed of gift, and sends the Bishop of Prague, Tobias, to Krakow with an army. End quote. You have to imagine this goes poorly, right? Well, like me, you are in for a surprise. Because it turns out that Przemysł, despite having a significantly more powerful army, decides not to oppose Wacław, and to instead focus his energies on Władysław the Short. So Wacław's army shows up in Krakow, leaving a small garrison behind them, and return to Prague. Notably with Gryfina in tow as a hostage so that she won't revoke the gift that she apparently illegally made before she dies a few years later in Prague. But while Gryfina didn't live long enough to see the effect of her gift, everyone else did, and they saw Wacław begin to style himself as the Duke of Krakow and Sandomierz. So now we have another contender to the throne of Krakow, but with a key difference: this one is Czech. You can only imagine that there was resistance to this idea. We hear a bit about this resistance from the eminent Polish historian Paul Knoll in his book, The Rise of the Polish Monarchy. Knoll tells us that, quote, Wacław proceeded wisely to consolidate his rule in Krakow before turning to the problem of Władysław. On September 1, 1291, in a successful attempt to gain the support of all elements of the population of Little Poland, he issued from Litomyśl in Bohemia 2 great charters confirming the traditional rights, privileges, and prerogatives of the knights, clergy, and towns of Little Poland. He further guaranteed the income of both the bishop and the cathedral chapter at Krakow. In return, he was accepted as Duke of Krakow and Sandomierz. In order to make good upon the latter part of this title, however, he was forced to mount a military expedition against Władysław. In early autumn 1291, Wacław led an army in Sieradz, and despite determined opposition, Władysław was captured. On October 9th, Władysław renounced all claim to Krakow and Sandomierz and recognized Wacław as his suzerain, retaining Sieradz and Brzeszcz as compensation. Władysław seemed now almost wholly excluded from Polish affairs. With Wacław now master of Silesia and Little Poland, and Przemysł's fortunes in Greater Poland and Pomerania in rapid ascent, he was reduced to insignificance. It was in fact only his position as a member of the dynasty which enabled him to participate in a conference with Przemysł late in 1292 and early in 1293. End quote. That conference was going to be a pivotal moment in the lives of Przemysł, Wacław, Władysław, and frankly, all of Poland. This conference would decide the fate of the duchies and, hint hint, the fate of the kingdom. Knoll tells us that, quote, under the general sponsorship of Archbishop Jan Svinka, these 2 princes, together with the even more impotent Duke Casimir, gathered ostensibly to discuss financial support for the archbishop. But the nature of the support, the titles adopted by these rulers, and the political agreements arrived at in Kalisz mark this meeting as the formation of nothing less than, in the words of Balzer, an anti-Czech coalition. This conclusion is based upon the fact that shortly after Epiphany 1293, Przemysł promised to pay to Gniezno, to the extent that he was able or would be in the future, the sum of 300 silver marks yearly from the income of the salt mines south of Krakow, and to continue in the first 2 years after he had obtained possession of Krakow to make payments of 100 silver marks from the same source. At the same time, in a second document, the three rulers together, styling themselves all heirs to Krakow, agreed to the same financial arrangements as in the first document. Polish historians have almost universally understood the significance of these documents to be not only the intention of regaining the territory previously lost to Wacław, but also that the right to rule over Krakow would, if necessary, pass in turn from the strongest, Przemysł, then to Władysław, and finally to the weakest, Casimir. In the wake of this agreement, the personal relationship between Przemysł and Władysław was greatly strengthened when the latter married his first and only wife, Jadwiga, daughter of Bolesław the Chaste, and cousin of Przemysł. For the moment, however, Władysław's position was still a secondary one. End quote. Following this momentous summit, another even grander event takes place. This time, it's focused entirely on Przemysł. We hear of the events from Długosz, who tells us that in the year 1295, quote, Przemysł is known for his honesty and piety, and prompted by his mother, Duchess Elizabeth, a very pious woman, he strives to preserve the remains of his fatherland, not so much ill-fated as unhappy, and make it again a monarchy. He is convinced that if, under his leadership, it acquires one king and monarch, instead of having a number of dukes and princes, it will regain respect and happiness. It pains him to remember how, on the death without heir of his fourth cousin, Leszek the Black, Krakow and other parts of the kingdom were plunged into internecine war. Now he thinks of himself as monarch, and in this is encouraged by the prelates and lords of Poland and Pomerania, in whose eyes he alone of the Polish princes is worthy of wearing a royal crown. He is now 38 years old and heir to the dukedom of Pomerania. On the advice of his uncle, Bolesław of Kalisz, he marries Riksa, daughter of the King of Sweden, and she bore him a daughter who is given the same name as her mother. End quote. But it's not just a style of monarch and marrying other dynasties. No, Przemysł goes the full 9 yards and has himself crowned King of Poland on June 27, 1295. It had been over 200 years since Poland had had a monarch. It would not be another 200 years until it had its next. Now, don't get all excited and assume that this was some amazingly unifying event that would reverse the pain, torment, and torture of the fragmentation of Poland. But, I'll admit, it is a step in the right direction, which is rare, so kudos to everybody involved. But this step in the right direction turns into a stumble. That's because, in spite of the fact that Przemysł had a secure power base, in spite of the fact that he received papal approval to be crowned king, and despite the fact that he was allied with the people most likely to be his domestic rivals, Przemysł failed to do one thing: stay alive. Yes, just a few short months after he was crowned King of Poland, he was struck down by assassins. Długosz tells us that, quote, after spending Christmas in Poznan, as has been the custom of his ancestors, the king goes to Gniezno, where he spends some time amusing himself as far as attention to public affairs will allow, and then goes to Rogozno for carnival, lending splendor to the celebrations and presenting prizes to the victors in the tournament. The three margraves of Brandenburg, learning that the king is in Rogozno, a town without any defenses or even a wall round it, and presuming that, being preoccupied with amusing himself, he will not anticipate an attack nor set sentries, rapidly assemble a force of their own people and some mercenaries, and, at dead of night on Ash Wednesday, February the 8th, make their way through the vastnesses of the forest, and so reach Rogozno at dawn. Treacherously and fraudulently, for there has been no declaration of war, either in writing or by heralds, they attack the king in his bedroom, and his knights in their scattered lodgings, where they are sleeping off the previous day's junketing, unarmed, and quite unprepared to do battle. Although the king has no idea who is attacking him, or the number of his assailants, he and his men fight back, wounding and killing several of their attackers. For the king fights more as a soldier than a commander. But the sheer weight of the attackers' numbers and the thrusts of their many swords overcome him, and he falls, his body covered with wounds. The delighted enemy only want to get him back alive as proof of their victory and to provide a public spectacle. But when the Saxons set him on a horse, he is unable to keep his seat and slithers half dead to the ground. He is too weak even to be conveyed in a wagon, so, seeing no hope of him living until the morning, the furious Saxons thrust their stilettos into his body again and again. End quote. Przemysł obviously did not survive this, and was later buried next to his ancestors in Poznan. But while he no longer had to worry about Polish affairs, we do. And we'll pick up next time with the crucial question: Who is going to be king now? If you're enjoying the show, reviews on iTunes or any other podcast app are always appreciated. And as I've mentioned in the past, I have a new show out on the history of World War I called World's End, The Great War. You can subscribe to that in every podcast app. And of course, any support through Patreon is always greatly appreciated. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.